The egg cracked on the 44th day of winter, which the elder dragons of Drasvith considered a good sign. Winter hatchlings were supposed to be calm, patient, and serious. The cold season shaped a mind that way. It settled things down before they had a chance to get loud. The hatchling that came out of that egg was copper-scaled, small even by hatchling standards, and immediately curious about everything around him. He pressed his tiny snout against the stone floor of the creche, sniffed it twice, then looked up at the row of elder dragons watching him from across the hall. He blinked. They blinked back. He decided he would study all of them eventually. His name was Rin. The creche of Drasvith was a long, cold hall of black stone, carved into the base of the oldest mountain on the planet. It had been used for hatchings for 6,000 years. The walls were covered in old carvings that told the history of the dragon clans, and the floors were smooth from the feet of countless hatchlings who had walked across them before. There was no noise in the creche except for the low hum of wine through the ventilation shafts and the soft sound of elder dragons breathing. Noise was considered undignified. Silence was the first thing a hatchling was supposed to learn. Rin learned it within a day. He was quiet. He watched. He did what he was told. But on his third day, something happened that he could not explain and could not stop thinking about afterward. A human walked into the creche. This was not unusual, technically. The Drasvith Council had agreed, some months earlier, to a diplomatic science exchange with the human government. The details were long and complicated and involved several dozen meetings between very old dragons and very patient human diplomats. The result was that 2 human researchers were now stationed at a facility attached to the mountain, with limited access to the creche for observation purposes. The elder dragons disapproved of this arrangement in the quiet, dignified way they disapproved of most things, which was to say they never actually said they disapproved. They simply made it very clear through the quality of their silence. The human who came into the creche that morning was a woman with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, wearing a gray research coat that was slightly too big for her shoulders. Her name was Dr. Nora Holt, and she was a xenobiologist, which meant she studied living things that were not human, which on Drasvith meant she spent most of her time being stared at by dragons who found her fascinating in the way one might find an unusual rock formation fascinating. Interesting to look at, not particularly important. She carried a small recording device in a bag over one shoulder, and she moved carefully, the way people do when they are trying very hard not to bother anyone. She was crossing the main floor of the creche, heading toward the far corner where she was allowed to sit and observe, when the strap of her bag caught on the edge of one of the carved stone ledges that lined the walls. She pulled at it without looking, misjudged the angle, and stepped directly onto the curved piece of Rin's broken eggshell that was still lying on the floor where it had been left after the hatching ceremony. The shell skidded. Her foot went sideways. She grabbed the ledge, missed it, grabbed it again, and somehow managed to stay upright, but only barely, and only after a series of lurching, graceless movements that sent her bag sliding off her shoulder and landing on the floor with a loud thud. She stood there for a moment, hands on the ledge, breathing hard, eyes wide. Then she laughed. It came out of her all at once, unannounced, loud and completely uncontrolled. It was a full laugh, the kind that comes from the stomach, with a small snort in the middle of it, and then another wave of it right after because the snort itself was funny, and her eyes went bright and wet, and she pressed her free hand over her mouth trying to stop it and failing completely. Every dragon in the creche went still. The 2 elder dragons near the far wall turned their massive heads slowly in her direction. The 3 younger dragons in the observation alcove above went rigid. The attendant who had been quietly sorting records in the corner stopped moving entirely. Silence in the creche was not just a preference. It was, in some ways, the architecture of the place. The walls were built to hold it. The stone absorbed it. The laugh hit all of that like a stone thrown into still water. Nora recovered quickly. She straightened up, pushed her hair back from her face, picked up her bag, and looked around at every dragon now staring at her with expressions that were difficult to read, but clearly not warm. Her face went red. She said, in a voice that had gone very small, that she was sorry, that it was an accident, and that she would be more careful. Then she walked quickly to her corner and sat down and did not make another sound for the rest of the morning. The elder dragons returned to their quiet business. The attendant went back to sorting records. The three younger dragons in the alcove eventually stopped watching. Rin did not stop watching. He was still very small, barely the length of a human forearm, and he was sitting on the low hatching platform in the center of the creche where new hatchlings were kept for the first week. He had been looking at the wall carvings when the sound happened. He had turned to look at the human the moment he heard it, and now he could not turn away. He had heard many sounds in his 3 days of life. The low hum of the ventilation, the deep, slow breathing of the elders, the scratch of claws on stone, the distant rumble of wind outside the mountain. He understood all of those sounds, not because anyone had explained them, but because they fit into the world the way he expected it to be. This sound did not fit. It was not language. It was not a warning. It was not a call of any kind that he knew. It was short and loud and completely unguarded, and it came from somewhere inside the human, and for a moment, just a moment, it had filled the entire hall. He had felt something happen in his chest when he heard it. Not fear, not alarm. Something else, something he had no word for yet, something that had made him want to hear it again immediately. He looked at the human in the corner. She was sitting very still now, head down, making notes on a small device, pretending with great effort that she had not just done something extraordinary. Rin did not take his eyes off her for the rest of the morning. That evening, when the creche was quiet and the elder dragons had settled into their slow, thoughtful sleep, he tried to understand what he had heard. He replayed it in his memory the way the elders had taught him to replay things, carefully and completely. The sound had started suddenly. It had no warning. It had layers in it, a kind of rising and falling, and underneath it something that seemed almost like relief, like the human had been holding something tightly and had simply let it go. He thought about the face she made when it happened. Her eyes had gone soft and bright at the same time. Her whole body had loosened, just for a moment, before she caught herself. He did not know what any of it meant, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in his chest like a warm coal, that he needed to understand it. And more than that, he needed to hear it again. He was a dragon. He was 3 days old. He had the patience of stone and the memory of deep water. He would figure this out. From across the long hall, half hidden in the shadows near the entrance to the council corridor, an elder dragon named Sorval watched his grandson stare at the human researcher with an expression of absolute, focused intent. Sorval had lived for 600 years. He had seen many things. He had never seen a hatchling look at anything quite like that. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched and thought and said nothing at all. There was a loose stone in the wall behind the eastern water channel, just wide enough for a copper-scaled hatchling to fit through if he tucked his wings flat and did not breathe too deeply. Rin had found it on his 5th day of life while the attendants were occupied with the feeding ceremony for the older hatchlings. He had not told anyone about it. He had filed it away in the careful, organized space of his memory under things that might be useful later, and he had left it alone. On his 9th day, he used it. On the other side of that wall was a narrow maintenance passage that ran the length of the creche building and opened, at its far end, into the back corridor of the research facility attached to the mountain. Rin knew this because he had listened to the attendants discuss the facility layout during his first week, and he had a very good memory. He moved through the passage slowly, staying low, keeping his claws from clicking on the stone. He had practiced the click problem for 2 days before attempting this. He was not going to be careless. The research facility smelled of something sharp and clean, very different from the deep mineral smell of the creche. There were lights on the ceiling that did not flicker. The floors were a different material, smoother, and slightly warm underfoot, which was surprising. Rin made a note of that. The corridor had several doors, all of them closed, and through one of them he could hear movement. He found a ventilation grill near the floor, pulled it open with one careful claw, and slipped inside. The ventilation shaft above the main research room was narrow but manageable, and had a grill at the bottom that let him see the entire room below without being seen himself. He settled into position, tucked his tail in behind him, and looked down. Dr. Nora Holt was sitting at a long table covered in instruments and papers and small objects Rin could not identify. She had her recording device in one hand and was speaking into it in a low, steady voice, describing something she was looking at under a lens. Her research coat was the same gray one from the creche. There was a small stain near the left cuff that had not been there yesterday. She had her hair pinned back differently today. These details went into Rin's memory automatically. After a while, she stopped recording and leaned back in her chair and stretched both arms above her head with a sound of effort. Then she reached to the side of the table, opened a small container, and took out a piece of dried fruit which she put in her mouth and chewed while staring at the ceiling. Rin watched. He watched for 3 hours. He watched her work. He watched her stop working and make notes by hand. He watched her look out the small window at the side of the room for a while, saying nothing, doing nothing, just looking. He watched her pick up the recording device again, say 2 words into it, put it down, say 1 more word, then put it down again. He did not know what the words were. He did not speak the human language yet, though he intended to remedy that as quickly as possible. She did not laugh. Not once. Not even close. He went back the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day of observation, her partner arrived. He was a human male, slightly taller than Nora, with a narrow face and a way of moving that suggested he had too much energy and not enough room for it. His name, Rin eventually understood, was Dex, which was a remarkably short name for any species. He came in with 2 containers of hot liquid and set one in front of Nora without asking if she wanted it, which meant he knew her well enough not to need to ask. He dropped into the chair across from her, propped his feet on the edge of the table, and said something that made Nora look up from her work. She did not laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved. Rin noted this carefully. Corner movement. Possible precursor to the sound. He did not know yet. He would need more data. Over the next several days, he began to build a picture. He cataloged the conditions under which the corner of her mouth moved. He noted which things Dex said caused it and which did not. He began to understand that some of what Dex said was not intended to be taken as accurate information, which was very strange, because why would a person say things they did not mean? He spent 2 full evenings in the ventilation shaft trying to work out the logic of it. He eventually developed a hypothesis that the inaccurate statements were a kind of communication signal, a way of indicating closeness or comfort, and that the response was not about the information itself, but about the signal beneath it. He was not sure if this was correct, but it was the best he had so far. On the 8th day of observation, Nora made a mistake with one of her instruments and said a single sharp word very loudly. Then she looked at what she had done, closed her eyes, opened them, looked again, and her shoulders dropped. She sat like that for a moment. Then she pushed her hair back, pulled out a fresh set of notes, and started the work again from the beginning without saying anything else. Rin watched this and felt something that he did not have a word for yet, but that was something adjacent to respect. On the 12th day, she left something on the floor of the corridor near the ventilation grill. He noticed it when he arrived that evening. It was small and rectangular, and it produced a very quiet, layered sound when he touched the surface with one claw. It was a recording device, clearly left deliberately, because it was placed directly below the grill in a position nobody passing through the corridor would naturally leave something. She knew he was there. He sat with this information for a long time. Then he picked up the device with both front claws and listened to it. It was sounds, many different sounds, layered over each other in complex patterns, rising and falling in ways that were clearly intentional. He did not know what it was, but it moved through him in a way he did not expect, something in the rhythm of it landing in his chest like the laugh had landed, warm and strange and not unpleasant. He listened to it 4 times before he put it back on the floor. The next evening, there was a folded piece of printed material. A picture. It showed a large round object, blue and white and brown, hanging in dark space. He stared at it for a long time. He understood from context and from things the elders had said that this was probably the human homeworld. He looked at it carefully, memorizing every detail, and then he placed it flat on the floor and stepped on it very gently with one claw, the way young dragons indicated acknowledgement, and left it there. The evening after that, there was a small dried thing in a transparent wrapper. He opened the wrapper. He sniffed the dried thing. He ate it. The sneeze that followed was immediate, enormous, and completely beyond his control. It came out of him with enough force to rattle the ventilation shaft, and it produced, at its peak, a short, sharp burst of fire that scorched a black mark into the ceiling of the shaft roughly 3 feet above his head. From below, through the grill, he heard a sound. It was the laugh. Not as big as the first one, but the same, warm and unguarded and real. Rising up through the grill from below, lasting only a few seconds, then dissolving into something quieter and softer, but still shaped by what had just happened. Rin sat in the ventilation shaft with a scorched ceiling above him and a completely undignified amount of smoke coming out of his nostrils, and he felt something so large and so complete that he did not know what to do with it. He was going to need a bigger methodology. He pulled out the small flat stone he had started using as a note surface, took a careful claw tip, and began writing. Observation log, day 19. The subject responds to unexpected physical outcomes. The response is involuntary. It requires surprise. Planned events do not produce it. Repeat attempts will likely fail. He paused, added one more line. The dried fruit item was unacceptably effective. Request more of the dried fruit item. He tucked the stone under his wing and started back through the ventilation shaft toward the creche. He was smiling. He did not know yet that this was something dragons were not supposed to do, at least not in a way that showed. The Council of Drasvith met twice each season, in the deep chamber below the creche, where the stone was so old it had gone smooth as water and the air smelled of centuries. It was not a place for hatchlings. Hatchlings were expected to spend their first year in the creche, learning silence and observation and the long, quiet habits of draconic thought. Petitions from hatchlings to address the council did not exist as a formal category, because no hatchling had ever tried to submit one. Rin submitted one on his 42nd day of life. He wrote it on 3 flat stones, in precise claw script, which was already neater than most adult dragons managed after decades of practice. He gave the stones to the creche attendant on morning watch and asked that they be passed to the council secretary. The attendant looked at the stones. He looked at Rin. He looked at the stones again. He said nothing, because nothing seemed adequate, and he passed the stones along. The council summoned Rin 6 days later, not because they wanted to hear from a hatchling, but because the petition was so specific and so formally correct in its structure and language that refusing it would have required them to invent a new rule to justify the refusal, and elder dragons did not enjoy inventing new rules. It felt undignified. Rin walked into the deep chamber on the day of the council session and found himself facing 11 dragons whose combined age was somewhere in the region of 4,000 years. They were seated in the curved stone gallery above him, looking down, their expressions doing the careful dragon thing of revealing nothing while clearly conveying that they had feelings about this situation. His grandfather Sorval was at the far end of the gallery. His face was as still as the others. Rin looked at him for one moment, then turned to face the center of the chamber and began. He had called his presentation a preliminary examination of the human emotional response mechanism known as laughter, with particular focus on its structural triggers and communicative function. It ran to 17 points. He had been working on it for 3 weeks. He delivered it from memory, which was the only way a dragon of any age was expected to deliver anything before the council. He described his initial observation with precision, including the exact conditions of the floor, the angle of the strap, the nature of the eggshell, and the resulting physical sequence that had produced the sound. He then described his subsequent observation program, its methods, its duration, and its preliminary findings. He described the corner of mouth precursor event and its relationship to what Dex said. He described the involuntary nature of the response and his hypothesis about the role of surprise. He described, in clinical detail, the dried fruit incident, including the scorched ceiling, because he believed in complete data reporting. The council was silent throughout. The silence had a texture that Rin could not quite read. He pressed on anyway. He explained that laughter appeared to function as an involuntary signal emitted when an expected outcome was suddenly replaced by an unexpected one, provided the unexpected outcome was not dangerous. He explained that it seemed to have a communicative purpose, drawing attention to the gap between expectation and reality, and possibly indicating to others that the situation was safe despite its suddenness. He explained that its effect on the subject appeared to be briefly releasing, as if something held tightly was let go, and that this release appeared to produce a state that the human researcher in question seemed to find, at least temporarily, beneficial. He concluded with 3 proposed areas for further study and a request for official council approval of his ongoing observation program. Then he stood quietly and waited. The council took 12 minutes of unbroken silence to respond. What followed was, by the standards of draconic council debate, remarkably lively. Elder Vareth, The oldest member asked whether it was medically possible for a hatchling to be defective in the area of priorities. Elder Koss said she did not think defective was the right word, but was open to synonyms. Elder Baron said he had read the petition 3 times and was still not certain it was real. Elder Gorn said that the fact that it was real was what concerned him. Sorval said nothing. The council did not grant the observation program official approval. What they granted, after 20 minutes of further discussion, was a formal notation that the research existed, which was not the same as approval, but was also not a prohibition, and which, in the long and elaborate legal structure of draconic governance, essentially meant Rin could continue doing what he was doing as long as he did not do it loudly. Rin considered this a success. He wrote it down on his stone as a success. He did not know that Dex had already discovered the observation log. Dex had gone into the ventilation shaft 2 days earlier to check a heating unit. He had found the stone log sitting on a ledge just inside the shaft where Rin always left it. He had taken a picture of every page. He had brought the pictures to Nora. Nora had sat with them for a long time without speaking. Then she had said, very quietly, that she needed to tell him something, and she had told him about the things she had been leaving near the grill. Dex had read the log entries twice. Then he had read the line about the dried fruit and the scorched ceiling again. Then he had started laughing, and he had laughed for a long time, and Nora had eventually started too, and they had sat in the research room for 10 minutes just laughing at the mental image of a hatchling the size of a house cat sitting in a ventilation shaft with smoke coming out of his nose, taking very serious notes. Dex had sent the pictures to his brother, because his brother was a biologist too and would appreciate it. His brother had sent them to a colleague. The colleague had posted a summary on the academic infonet, framed as a curiosity piece about alien observation methodology. The summary had been read by 11,000 people within 48 hours. None of this had reached the Drasvith Council yet. It would. But for now, Rin walked back to the creche with his formal notation of existence, past the attendant who had passed the stones along, past the junior council clerks who had heard the session through the walls and were now watching him with expressions he could not identify, and settled back onto the hatching platform. He pulled out his stone. He wrote 3 new entries. Entry 37. The council has acknowledged the research. Reaction: mixed. This is acceptable. Mixed means divided. Divided means some of them find it interesting. Entry 38. Elder Vareth asked whether I was defective. I do not believe I am defective. I will include his question in my study as an example of how established systems respond to data they have not encountered before. Entry 39. I did not achieve laughter today. However, based on Dex's pattern of response, showing him the council session notes secondhand should produce a statistically high probability of the sound. I will explore this in the next observation window. He tucked the stone away. From the far end of the creche, watching his grandson sit quietly in the low afternoon light and writing claw script on a piece of slate, Sorval felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He did not name it. Dragons of his age were not in the habit of naming feelings they could not immediately explain. He simply watched the hatchling work and did not leave and said nothing. Later that evening, alone in his chamber, he read the petition again from his own copied notes. All 17 points. He read the conclusion 3 times. He set the notes down on the stone. He looked at the wall for a while. He did not laugh. That was not something he did. But the corners of his mouth moved, just slightly, in the direction they had not moved in many years. He noticed this. He did not stop it. He simply let it happen, and then let it go, and went back to his reading. The Velhari were not, by nature, an easily alarmed species. They were tall, gray-skinned, with elongated heads and eyes that registered color at wavelengths most other species could not see. They had been traveling between star systems for 3,000 years before humanity had discovered fire, and they carried themselves with the very particular kind of calm that comes from believing, with reasonable evidence, that you are the most organized civilization in the known galaxy. They did not panic. They assessed. They wrote reports. They held meetings in rooms with very good air quality and decided things carefully. So when the summary of Rin's observation log appeared on the Galactic academic infonet and began spreading at a rate that the Velhari social monitoring systems flagged as abnormal, the response from the Velhari consensus was not panic. It was a series of carefully worded memos, followed by a formal assessment request, followed by the dispatch of Admiral Grau to the Drasvith system, which was only slightly more alarming than a memo and considerably more expensive. Grau was not the kind of person who smiled. He had a face that seemed to have been designed for the expression of concern, and he wore that expression in all weather and at all hours. He had spent 40 years in the Consensus Fleet doing the work of keeping different species from making catastrophic decisions in each other's vicinity, and he had developed a view of interspecies contact that was fundamentally cautious. New contacts were unpredictable. Unpredictable things created instability. Instability was bad. This was not a complicated philosophy, but it had kept him employed for a long time. The thing that had triggered the latest assessment request was not just the observation log itself. It was what the log represented. A species that had been formally contacted for less than a decade was now, apparently, producing such emotionally unusual behavior that a hatchling from the oldest space-faring civilization in this sector had spent 6 weeks in a ventilation shaft studying it. The Marathai Collective had sent a polite inquiry to the Consensus asking whether anyone else found this statistically interesting. The academic post had been reshared across 7 different species networks. 3 universities had submitted contact requests to the Drasvith Council asking whether the hatchling researcher was available for interview. The Drasvith Council had responded to all 3 universities with a silence so heavy it had almost a physical weight. Grau arrived at Drasvith in a Consensus cruiser that was, by Dragon standards, extremely small and, by human standards, very large. He had 2 aides, 1 cadet, and a translator with a particularly good memory for draconic formal speech patterns. He set up in the diplomatic receiving hall adjacent to the research facility and began scheduling interviews. Nora was the first human he saw. He sat across from her at a long table and asked her, in a measured way, to describe the nature of her relationship with the hatchling researcher. Nora thought about this for a moment. She said she was not sure she would call it a relationship in any formal sense. She said the hatchling had been observing her, and she had noticed, and she had started leaving things near the ventilation grill because it seemed like the reasonable response to being studied by something that was clearly trying very hard. Grau looked at his notes. He asked her whether she had considered that engaging with the hatchling's observation program might be seen as an endorsement of unsanctioned interspecies contact. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said she had considered that it was a baby dragon who was curious about her, and that leaving a piece of dried fruit near a vent seemed unlikely to destabilize galactic politics. Grau wrote something down. He saw Dex next. Dex came in, sat down, said something dry and brief about the length of the table, and then waited. Grau asked him about the dissemination of the observation log images. Dex said he sent them to his brother, who was a biologist, because it was the most interesting thing he had seen since arriving at Drasvith. Grau asked whether he had considered the implications of distributing sensitive research documentation. Dex said it was a picture of a hatchling's field notes scratched onto a piece of slate with a claw. Grau wrote something else down. Then Rin came in. He came in on his own, which no one had told him to do, and no one had expected. He had heard the schedule being discussed in the corridor and had simply appeared at the appropriate time. He was 3.5 months old now, noticeably larger than at hatching, but still small enough that the chair across from Grau was proportionally very large, and he climbed into it with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who was not going to apologize for needing to climb. He looked at Grau. Grau looked at him. Rin said, in very careful and recently acquired basic Velhari, that his name was Rin, and that he had been informed an Admiral Grau was here to assess the situation, and that he had a proposal. Grau's translator made a small sound. Rin said that his current research had produced 14 confirmed laughter events across 2 human subjects, with a combined observation log of 56 entries, and that he believed he had developed enough methodology to attempt something he had not tried before. He said that he intended to make Grau laugh before the Admiral's visit concluded. There was a silence. Grau said that was not going to happen. Rin said, very calmly, that he noted that response, and that he would adjust his methodology accordingly. He said he was not discouraged by early resistance. He said this was, in fact, consistent with his data on first contact laughter production in unfamiliar subjects, which typically showed a resistance phase before the involuntary response threshold was reached. He said he was prepared to be patient. Grau looked at the hatchling sitting across from him in the large chair, speaking clear Velhari with a slight draconic accent, discussing laughter threshold methodology the way a battle commander discusses engagement strategy. He wrote something in his notes. The translator later told one of the aides that what Grau had written was the single word, extraordinary. The cadet who had come with Grau was a young Velhari named Pip, small for her species, with careful eyes and the habit of watching things closely without appearing to. She had been standing near the door during the interview. After Rin climbed out of his chair and left, she remained standing in the doorway for a moment. Then she went after him. She found him in the corridor outside. She said, in basic Velhari, that she thought what he was doing was interesting. She said she had read all 56 entries of the observation log that had been posted. She said she had a question, if he did not mind. Rin looked up at her. He said he did not mind. She said, the log mentions that laughter seems to happen when something unexpected occurs that is not dangerous. She said she wanted to know how he decided what counted as not dangerous. She said that seemed like the hard part. Rin looked at her for a long time. Then he said that was the right question. He said he had been thinking about it for weeks and had not settled on a satisfactory answer. He said the best he could offer so far was that not dangerous seemed to be determined by context, specifically by whether the subject felt safe at the moment the unexpected thing happened, and that safety was not just physical, it was something about the relationship between the people involved, a kind of trust that made the surprise feel acceptable rather than alarming. He paused. He said he thought that might be why Nora had laughed the first time even though she was surrounded by dragons, which were, by most reasonable measures, dangerous. Because she had decided before she walked in that she was not going to be harmed. And once she decided that, her body was free to respond to the unexpected the way it wanted to. Pip stood in the corridor and thought about this for a moment. She said, quietly, that was a very interesting theory about trust. Rin agreed that it was. He said it was also a very interesting theory about what humanity had apparently decided about every species it had ever encountered, because they kept turning up in places where they had no business being safe, and laughing anyway. He said he was still working out what that meant. Pip walked back to Grau's office and said nothing to the Admiral about what had just happened. But that evening, in her own notes, she wrote the same word Grau had written and underlined it twice. The news came through on a quiet morning, in a message that Nora read twice before she put the device down on the table. It said, in the careful and impersonal language of administrative correspondence, that the Joint Human-Dragon Exchange Program was under formal review by both the Human Science Council and the Drasvith Diplomatic Committee, and that pending review, the research mandate was suspended. It said the process would take between 2 and 4 months. It said she and Dex were welcome to remain at the facility during review or return to their home station if they preferred. Nora did not say anything to Dex when he came in. She put the message in her records file. She opened her current research notes. She looked at them for a while. Then she closed the notes and looked at the wall instead. Dex read the message himself, because the same notification had been sent to his account. He came in, saw Nora looking at the wall, and sat down across from her, and did not say anything either. The two of them sat in the research room in silence, which was unusual for them, and the silence was a different kind from the creche. It had weight in it. After a while, Dex said they probably needed to start preparing the research storage protocols. Nora said yes, probably. They did not do that yet. They sat a little longer. Rin noticed that afternoon, from the ventilation shaft. He had come for his regular observation window, and immediately understood that something was different. He could read her face now. After 2 months of study, the way you can read a landscape you have walked every day. The set of her shoulders was wrong. The quality of her stillness was wrong. She was not working. She was not looking at anything. She was doing the same thing he had seen her do in the days after she received a message from her homeworld that had made her cry. She was being very quiet in a way that was not the same as calm. He sat in the shaft for a long time. He thought about what he knew. He knew that in humans, silence like this was different from draconic silence. Draconic silence was used for thought, for composure, for the careful arrangement of things. Human silence was often the space left when something had been taken away. It was the shape of an absence. He did not want to leave and come back tomorrow and find her quieter. He tried, on that first day, the things he had learned. He sent a small piece of material tumbling down through the grill, something he had shaped carefully into the form of an object she had once laughed at in a picture on her desk. She looked at it. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not the laugh. She picked the thing up and looked at it for a while, and then she set it on the table near her recording device and went back to being quiet. He tried indirect wordplay the next day, delivered through the grill in careful basic, which he had been practicing. She looked up at the sound of his voice. He delivered the line. She understood it. He could see that she understood it, and she did the small, soft exhale that sometimes preceded the laugh. But not today. Today it just settled into the quiet. He tried a story on the third day. He told it in a low voice through the grill, a short account of what had happened when Elder Vareth attempted to operate a human-made instrument he had found in the diplomatic receiving hall without asking anyone what it did. Vareth had pressed 3 buttons in the wrong order, and the instrument had made a sound like a small animal being startled repeatedly. Rin had seen this happen and had taken very detailed notes. Dex laughed when he heard the story. He laughed for quite a while. Nora watched Dex laugh, and something eased in her face, a small softening, but she did not produce the sound herself. Rin sat in the shaft and thought. He thought for 2 full days. He went back to his stone log and read every entry. He read the first one, from day 19, and then the entry from day 32 about the corner of mouth precursor, and then the entry from day 45 about trust and safety and the way laughter required you to feel, somewhere in your body, that the thing happening was not a threat. He read his own conclusion again. He had written that laughter was involuntary, but that involuntary was not the same as uncontrollable. He had written that the conditions for it had to exist before the trigger could work. The right conditions, the right amount of safety, the right relationship. He thought about the relationship. He thought about what it actually was, what he and Nora Holt actually had, after months of observation and dried fruit and careful notes and things left near the grill. He thought about what he actually knew about her, and how much of it she knew he knew, and what that meant in the context of the theory he had built. On the 5th day of her silence, he did something he had never done before. He went a pip. He found her in the auxiliary room she had been using as a workspace, sitting with a language guide open on her screen, trying to learn the rudiments of draconic formal speech. She was doing badly. He sat across from her and waited for her to notice him. She looked up. She said she was going to need help with the tonal marks. He said he would help her later. He said he needed something first. He needed her to come with him. An hour later, Rin stood in the corridor outside the research room, which was open, and Pip stood slightly behind him, and Dex was inside the room already, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, because Rin had found Dex first. Nora was sitting at the table. She looked up when she heard the sound of claws in the doorway. Rin walked in. He sat down on the floor in front of her table, which put him roughly at eye level with her when she was seated, and he looked at her, and then he began to speak. He spoke in formal Draconic first, which was the only way he knew how to say things that mattered, because formal Draconic was precise, and it did not leave room for accidentally meaning less than you intended. Then he paused, and Pip, from the doorway, translated, slowly and carefully, in the way she had practiced. He said that she was strange. He said she was frequently too loud for the creche, and had been since the first day. He said she carried too many things in too many pockets, and he had cataloged 17 different items from those pockets across his observation period, and still could not account for the purpose of 3 of them. Nora looked at him. She did not say anything. He said she talked to herself when she was working. He said she cried and laughed at the same time, which was still the most confusing data point in his entire log, and he had a theory about it, but he was not yet confident. He said she gave food to a hatchling she barely knew through a ventilation grill without being asked, which was not scientifically efficient, and he had been thinking about what that meant for a long time. Pip's voice in the doorway was steady and careful. He said that he had seen 3 moons from the creche roof. He said he had read the entire Drasvith hatchery archive, which contained 12,000 years of recorded draconic thought and history. He said he had observed 41 different subjects in his short life, from elder dragons to Velhari admirals, and had learned something from each of them. He said she was the most interesting thing he had seen since he opened his eyes. The room was completely quiet. Then he said, in basic so she would not need the translation, that he did not know what was going to happen with the review, and that he was not very large yet, and did not have much influence over council decisions. But he knew what it sounded like when something mattered, even if he had not always had the word for it. And this mattered. Nora looked at him for a long time. Then she laughed. It came out of her the way the first one had, unannounced and uncontrolled, and it was the same laugh, warm and real and full, but it had something else in it this time, something he had not heard before, and after a few seconds it ran together with the other thing, the crying, both of them at once, which was still the most confusing data point in his log, and which he was now absolutely certain he understood. He reached forward and placed one small copper claw very gently on the back of her hand. He had never done that before. He did not remove it. Dex pressed his hand over his eyes and said nothing. Pip, in the doorway, had stopped translating. She was watching, and her face had gone very still. At the far end of the corridor, having arrived without sound or announcement, Sorval stood. He had not been here when Rin began. He had come because one of the attendants had seen the hatchling walk purposefully toward the human wing with a Velhari cadet, and the attendant had thought someone should know. Sorval stood in the corridor and watched his grandson hold a human's hand and say something he had not been taught and had not read anywhere, something he had arrived at entirely on his own, from study and observation and curiosity and the particular kind of careful love that looks like science until you look at it long enough. Sorval had lived for 600 years. He turned and walked back to the council chamber without making a sound. He called an emergency session at sunset. When he stood before the 11 elders, he said only one thing. He said the program would not be shut down. He did not explain. He did not need to. He was Sorval. He had been Sorval for a very long time. He sat down, and the session ended. Nobody asked him why. They had seen the look on his face. They had not seen that look on Sorval before, but they knew, the way old things know old things, what it meant. It meant something had finally changed his mind about something, and it had not taken 6,000 years of archives to do it. It had taken a hatchling and a human and 5 days of silence in a single room. 6 months after the first laugh, the research facility at Drasvith had more occupants than it had been designed for. There were 2 new human researchers who had arrived on the second exchange shuttle, a quiet man named Will who studied atmospheric biology, and a woman named Fun who studied language and who immediately started following Rin around with a recording device, which Rin tolerated because turnabout, as Dex had explained, was fair play. There were 3 Velhari academics who had come through official consensus channels and who spent most of their time being slightly overwhelmed by the dragons and writing long reports about it. There was Pip, who had not returned to fleet duty when Grau's inspection concluded, because she had applied for and received a research placement through the Consensus Education Division, and who was now, in Rin's estimation, one of the 3 most useful people in the facility. Rin himself was now roughly the size of a large dog, though shaped nothing like one. His copper scales had deepened in color. He had developed the habit of sitting in the middle of whatever room had the most activity, rather than observing from a distance, which was still somewhat unusual for a dragon, but which nobody had officially told him to stop. He had also developed the habit of standing very still and watching new arrivals for several minutes before introducing himself, which several of the new researchers had found alarming until someone thought to put a note in the facility welcome materials explaining it. The note said, "If you see a copper dragon watching you from across the room, do not be concerned. He is doing science." The observation log had reached 312 entries. He had given Pip the task of translating the physical stone log into digital format so it would not be lost if anything happened to the stone. Pip had spent 2 weeks on this and had told him, when she was finished, that she now understood the last 6 months considerably better than she had understood them while living through them. Rin had said that was the purpose of documentation. Pip had said that was the most dragon thing he had ever said. Rin had considered this a compliment. The Galactic response to the leaked summary had settled, in the months since, into something more organized than the initial noise. The Marathai Collective had published a formal academic paper citing the observation log as a significant case study in what they called asymmetric curiosity dynamics, the phenomenon of a species showing intense interest in another species that had not expected to be interesting. The paper had been downloaded 40,000 times. Rin had read it and made 11 annotations on his copy, 8 of which were corrections. 3 different species had requested expedited contact with humanity following the events at Drasvith. The Human Diplomatic Office was, according to Dex, completely unprepared for this and was handling it with the specific brand of cheerful chaos that humans brought to most things they had not planned for. Grau had filed his official report to the Velhari consensus 4 months ago. It was 20 pages long. It was, by Grau's standards, a deeply personal document, though nothing in it would read that way to anyone who did not know him. It described the human-dragon exchange in precise and measured terms. It described the observation log. It described the interview with the hatchling researcher. In the section on conclusions, it said that humanity represented a class of interspecies contact behavior that existing consensus models did not adequately account for. It said they appeared to operate on an assumption of connection that preceded evidence for connection, and that this assumption, while logically unsound, appeared to produce outcomes that were statistically favorable. It recommended the consensus develop new models. It recommended expanded contact protocols. It did not say anything like remarkable or extraordinary. In the margin of his personal copy, which no one else had seen, he had written, "We have been doing this wrong." Grau himself was back at Drasvith because the consensus had appointed him as the permanent liaison for the sector, a role that had not existed before and that had been created specifically because of the report. He was not, by his own assessment, happy about being stationed on a planet full of dragons and humans. He was, by anyone else's assessment, clearly more comfortable here than he had been on the day he arrived. Rin had been working on him for weeks. Not systematically. Not with the formal methodology of the early observation log. In a more relaxed way, more like the way Dex talked to people, with the dry remark and the well-timed observation and the willingness to say something unexpected and see what happened. He had gotten better at it. Pip had helped. She had what Rin had come to think of as natural instincts for the gap between expectation and reality, for finding the exact point where a thing turned sideways in a way that was safe. On the afternoon of a cold day, 6 months and 3 days after the first laugh, Rin found Grau in the diplomatic receiving hall reviewing a stack of consensus communications on a data screen. He sat across from him and waited until Grau looked up. Grau looked at him with the expression he wore most of the time now, which was still concern but was a slightly warmer variety of it. Rin said, in clear Velhari, that he had a question for the Admiral. Grau said he could ask it. Rin said, if a dragon spent 6 months in a research facility watching 2 humans and 1 Velhari cadet, and developed, over that time, a theory about why humanity had not been destroyed by any of the species it encountered despite showing up everywhere without invitation and behaving in ways no threat assessment protocol would predict as survivable, what would the Admiral say that theory was? Grau looked at him. He said he would say the theory was that humanity was very good at making other species decide they did not want to destroy them. Rin said that was exactly it. But he said he had a follow-up question. He said, how did they do that? Grau was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did not know. Rin said he thought he did know, or at least he had a working hypothesis. He said it was because humans laughed. Not specifically, not only the sound itself, but the thing behind it, the willingness to be surprised in front of someone else, to let their body respond before their mind could arrange a more dignified reaction. He said that every species he had studied maintained a careful distance. They kept their reactions organized. They did not let things catch them. But humans got caught constantly. They got startled and delighted and confused and moved, and all of it showed immediately on their faces and in their voices and in their bodies. And somehow that showing, that complete failure to maintain a managed exterior, made every other species in the room decide that the humans were not a threat. Because only something that did not mean you harm laughed. Because only something that trusted you enough showed you that it had been surprised. He paused. He said, I believe the human laugh is not a weakness. I believe it is the most effective diplomatic tool in the galaxy, and humanity has absolutely no idea that it is using it. Grau looked at him for a long time. Then something happened to Grau's face. It was not the laugh. Not the full sound, not the unguarded burst that Nora had produced on the first day. It was quieter than that and quicker, but it was real. The corners of his mouth moved upward. There was a sound, brief, almost contained, that came from somewhere in his chest. His eyes changed. Something behind them loosened, just for a moment, the way Nora's had loosened, and then it was gone, and his face was calm again, but it had happened. Rin reached for his stone. He wrote 1 word and a date. Then he looked up at Grau and said that he was logging that as entry 313, first confirmed threshold event in Admiral Grau, Velhari consensus, on the subject of human diplomatic theory. Grau said, in a voice that was very carefully level, that the Admiral had no comment at this time. Rin said that was fine. He said he was patient. That evening, in the creche, Nora and Dex came to say goodnight, which had become a habit over the last few months that no one had formally established and no one had questioned. Nora's research coat was folded over her arm. She set it down on the warm stones near Rin's sleeping spot, the way she always did, because the creche was cold and he was still small enough that the extra warmth helped, and because she had started doing it months ago and neither of them had ever said anything about it. She sat near him for a while. Dex leaned in the doorway. They did not talk much. They did not need to. After she left, Rin lay on the warm stones with her coat draped over his back and the sound of distant human voices drifting through the ventilation, and he looked at the ceiling of the creche, which was very old stone with very old carvings in it, and he thought about what he wanted to write in the final entry of the log's first volume. He had been thinking about it for days. He wanted it to be correct. He wanted it to be precise. He was a dragon. He was 6 months old. He had the patience of stone and the memory of deep water, and he had spent all of that time studying one question, and he thought he had an answer now. Not a complete answer, not a final one, but the best one he had. He picked up the stone. He wrote slowly. Final entry, Volume 1. Hypothesis. Laughter is not a noise. It is not a reflex, though it functions like one. It is not a signal, though it communicates. It is the sound a mind makes when it discovers that the world around it has done something unexpected, and that the world around it is safe enough to let that matter. It is the sound of a creature realizing, without deciding to, that it is not alone. He set the stone down. From the doorway of the creche, Sorval read the entry over his grandson's shoulder. He had been there for some time. He had heard the voices and followed them, the way he had been doing for months without ever quite acknowledging that he was doing it. He read the last line twice. He said nothing. He turned and walked back down the long corridor, back toward the council chambers, back toward the weight of 600 years and everything he had thought he knew. He did not make a sound. But for the second time in the memory of anyone who knew him, the corners of his mouth moved in that quiet direction, and this time he did not stop them quickly. He let them stay. He walked all the way back to his chamber with that expression on his face, and by the time he sat down at his reading desk it had faded, because feelings passed, even in very old dragons. But it had happened, and the thing it had done to the air around him while it lasted, the way it had opened something, briefly, that had been closed a long time, that did not pass. That stayed.